This program is brought to you by the following proud sponsors. The Alltech Media Group, the region's leading multimedia video production and marketing company, creating powerful and innovative marketing strategies that deliver exponential returns.
Welcome again to a Randall Lewis seminar, and it took place last night with Frank Pine, who's the executive editor of the Southern California News Group. I think all of us who were there found it, both in the presentation and the Q&A, an exceptionally important evening. And the purpose of this exchange is to try to capture some of the kind of comments both from the presentation and the questions of last night. By way of introduction, the Southern California News Group is, except for the LA Times, the primary purveyor of news in Southern California. You have 11 different newspapers, 20 weeklies. So this is the important kind of news purveyor for all of us. Particularly for local or regional news in Southern California. And we're also doing this in a setting which we talked about last night, where obviously major changes are taking place. So people are no longer reading hard copies of papers. I think the statistic I saw is 2 out of 10 Americans now reads a hard copy. Students I teach at ECR, they not only don't read a hard copy, they don't read newspapers online. But economic habits or economic models changing, technology is changing, the consumption of news is changing, and it's an exciting time to have you here to talk about it. But I thought you began last night with this question: what's the purpose of journalism? If you could, I thought that you identified 3 important ideas of what good journalism is about.
Yes, definitely. I think now more than ever, journalism is exceptionally important to the public. When we talked last night, we talked about three different overlapping areas where journalism is important, and all of which kind of fall under the umbrella of the Fourth Estate, or the notion of the Fourth Estate. And they were one, ensuring that government is accountable to the governed. 2, making sure that the citizenry is well informed, that the public has the information that they need to contribute thoughtfully to democracy. And 3, to promote public discourse, to ensure that there is a shared frame of reference and to advance a common understanding and a common set of facts.
So what? Accountability, information, public discourse.
Yep, accountability, information, and public debate.
Just so people know who you are, you've been in this business with those objectives for what, 20?
Almost 25 years, yeah, in local news. I started at the Inland Valley Daily Bulletin in the mid-1990s, and I have worked all over Southern California. And these days I'm the executive editor of the Southern California News Group, as you said. We have 11 daily newspapers and associated websites, more than 20 weeklies, and a handful of magazines.
And for the inland area, it's
the Press Enterprise, the Daily Bulletin, the Sun in San Bernardino, and the Redlands Daily Fax.
So, and you are the newspaper of inland Southern California.
Yes, definitely.
Well, you started, I thought, and we tend to see the world from where we are right now, and you began with a kind of history of journalism, what newspapers were like back when this country began to first became a republic. Tell us a little bit about the newspapers of old and their change into the 20th century.
So, as a newspaper man, of course, I find the history of my own business fascinating, and I hope everyone else does too. But I also think that the past is prologue. That it tells us, knowing where we've been gives us better insight into where we are and where we're going. And I also think that when we look to the past, we see things that we see narratives that are true even into the present day. So I started last night by talking about the beginning of American newspapers, and I had an anecdote about the Boston Gazette, which was one of the first newspapers in the Americas, and was also the first newspaper to kind of be labeled an enemy of the state. Though at that time the state was the British Empire, and the Boston Gazette was relentlessly critical of Britain and the King and the handling of the colonies. One of the founding fathers, Samuel Adams, wrote more than 250 articles for the Gazette, many of them anonymously. The Sons of Liberty met in the offices of the Gazette before they went out and dumped tea in the harbor at the Boston Tea Party. So it was a very scrappy newspaper, a small newspaper, and intensely political. And one of the through lines of the presentation last night was the nature of newspapers, and I like to think of it in terms of promoting that public discourse. Throughout most of the history of newspapers in the Americas, newspapers were very partisan, right? They advanced a political ideology. Most of our founding fathers were involved with, and in some cases founded their own newspapers specifically to advance their party ideology.
And then you said somewhere in the 20th century a different kind of approach to journalism took place, which we somehow now see as in many ways as sort of the standard.
Right. In the 20th century, we adopted the idea of objective, disconnected journalism that doesn't take a position, right? And I think that it is important for news to be fair and well-rounded and to offer insight into all sides of an issue. But I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that people don't have opinions. And the idea that that news is going to be scrupulously without a position is very difficult to truly live up to, and hasn't really been the case for the majority of the history of newspapers.
Right. And then after the war, I mean, there's after World War II, I mean, there's a kind of the economic model of newspaper. Talk a little bit about that. Why? In middle 80s, 1980, 1970s, it was kind of the high point, the kind of flourishing in newspapers in the United States?
Well, throughout the 20th century, the technology for printing and distributing newspapers has obviously improved over the course of time. And it was in the early part of the 20th century with industrialization that you were really able to mass produce and mass deliver newspapers. And that led to a tremendous boom. And newspapers, I think, really peaked in the late 80s, early 90s, somewhere around 1990, where business was really, really booming. And since then, there has been a long, slow migration away from print that really accelerated in the early 2000s as the internet became more ubiquitous.
Give us some sense of that dimension of the change I mean, it pointed to me last night, advertising paid for journalism, right?
Yes. The business model for most of the last 250 years has been that the advertising underwrote the cost of the newsroom as well as the cost of print and delivery, right? So newspaper subscriptions were very cheap because there was so much advertising in the newspaper. And I think that for most of the history of newspapers, the perception was that the advertising was associated with the content. If you had a food section, for example, you had supermarket advertising in the food section. And that supermarket advertising presumably was there because there were recipes and stories about eating and so forth. But what we come to find is that in reality, the advertising was more associated with the means of distribution. In the 20th century and earlier, newspapers were far and away the best way to reach a local audience, right? You could target a message to a neighborhood and be certain that your message would land on these driveways, right? What we have seen more recently is that advertising has moved online, which is even cheaper than it was to put things in print, and even better in terms of being able to specifically target audience and demographics. And so the advertising has become uncoupled from the content. So now you have this duopoly of Google and Facebook that controls somewhere between 63% and 84% of all digital advertising, and they don't create content, right? They're delivering content that is created by other sources, newspapers, right? But it's their advertising. So now the advertising is disconnected from the content, and it raises the question of, well, who's going to pay for that content?
Right. Well, the rather remarkable decline both in people subscribing to papers and the newspaper advertising. We had these charts where
Yep.
both they peaked, and then this rather remarkable decline that's occurred.
So there are two things in play here. One of them is the decline in readership. People who don't read newspapers anymore, and there's a perception that people don't get news from newspapers anymore. But that's not really the case. People read fewer print newspapers, but the digital audience is growing. So last night, I showed a chart. I showed actually a couple of charts. One that showed the decline in print circulation,
right,
and one that showed the increase in digital readership. When you really look at audience across platforms, newspapers reach a broader audience now than they ever have before because of their reach on digital. So audience is not really the problem. The problem is revenue, right? And I also showed a chart on revenue declines across the newspaper industry. And the revenue declines have been dramatic as advertising has shifted away from print, which is where the majority of newspaper revenue was, and onto digital, and in many cases on digital platforms that are not newspapers, right? The Facebook, Google duopoly, which controls the majority of online advertising, and also platforms that, like Craigslist or eBay, that have displaced a lot of the classified verticals.
Yeah, why don't you just clarify why the loss of classified ads has been so devastating to newspapers? I think. I mean, to you it's obvious, but maybe you can.
Well, in their heyday, right? Newspapers were multiple sections. You had an A section which had your world and national news. You had a local section which had your local news. You had your special feature sections, your sports section, and your classified section. And that classified section was made up entirely of advertising that was sold by the line. So it was very lucrative, and it underwrote a lot of the content in the other sections of the newspaper where there might have been less advertising. And that classified advertising has gone online to platforms that are just more user-friendly and more efficient. If for example, you want to buy a couch, right, what's the best way to do it? Are you going to get on a magnifying glass and pour over classified ads? Or are you going to hop on Craigslist and type in couch and your zip code and immediately get back a list of couches with pictures?
There was someone from Corona last night who raised the question, I didn't quite say it, but you can find out national news on cable channels, and you could look in the New York Times and the Washington Post. But in terms of trying to find out information about what's happening in the Corona City Council, he can't find it anymore.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, that's the essential challenge that faces us today is, right, that local news has value. And that individual is a perfect example of that. He's fired up because he wants local news. And as the revenue model shifts, a funding mechanism has to be put in place for local news. People want that information. Somebody has to pay for it. And that's the crux of what I'm trying to get at when I talk about the risk to the fourth estate in terms of the changing newspaper business model, right? So if the advertising is going to go to search and social, something has to fund the content, right? Somebody has to pay for the content. Right. And that means it's either going to be sponsored by people who are investing in content for the benefit of the community, which kind of gets at a nonprofit model, or it's going to have to be paid for by the public, by people who are going to subscribe to and directly pay for news in a way that's different than they have before.
Talk a little bit about both models, because I think that because people are obviously testing out different approaches around the country. What's happened with the nonprofit efforts and the subscription efforts? What is taking place?
So I think you're seeing a couple of different things. There are lots of places where people are developing nonprofit models for journalism. Cal Matters here in California is a good example of that, and David Lesher from Cal Matters spoke in this series last month. They cover Sacramento, California state government. They're a nonprofit organization that does that and partners with other news organizations to distribute their content to readers throughout the state, including my organization.
And you use it?
Yeah, we've have an ongoing relationship with Cal Matters, use a lot of their stories, and collaborate with them on stories. It's heartening and gratifying to see something like that really working, and I'm very happy to see that. There are also newspapers that are owned by nonprofits in Philadelphia and in Florida. Great experiments happening there, and the development of those models. Separate from that, what you're also seeing is a mass movement in news where traditional newspapers are starting to charge for digital subscriptions, which is something that my company has started doing just earlier this month. I think that is a way to more directly establish revenue related to content, right? To create a situation where the revenue streams are more stable and the journalism is more sustainable. And so far, our digital subscriptions are working quite well. We're happy with the results.
Just for my interest, what's the difference between subscribing to a hard copy of the Press Enterprise versus having a digital version? What would be the difference in costs? Roughly,
it can be a pretty big difference. A subscription to the print edition is going to cost hundreds of dollars a year, whereas a subscription to digital, we're going to give it to you for 99 cents for the first month, and then we want $9.99 every 4 weeks thereafter. We charge by the week.
Yeah. So it's considerably less.
Mm-hmm. But also the expense to produce it is considerably less, right? It has to cover, a digital subscription has to cover the journalism, whereas a print subscription has to cover the price of print and delivery. And that's something that I've realized readers don't necessarily understand. They see the price of the newspaper going up while the size of the newspaper gets smaller, the newspaper itself gets smaller, and they don't always understand it. But when you think about it, the newspaper comes to your house 365 days a year, 7 days a week, rain or shine. And usually for $1 or $2 a day, right, depending on where you live and what your subscription rate is. Whereas on the other hand, you don't get mail 7 days a week, and if you add up the postage in your mailbox, it comes to considerably more on most days than a couple dollars. It is expensive to print newspapers and bring them to people's houses. And so one of the things that you're seeing newspapers doing is raising their subscription rates to try to make sure that circulation breaks even or maybe even makes a little money.
See over time migrating from hard copy to digital? Is that a pattern that's going to develop?
I think that's a pattern that is absolutely developing. We're seeing younger people relying more on digital, and in some cases not at all on print. One of the age-old questions is, how long is print going to live? At this point, I think there's still considerable demand for print. So I don't see us discontinuing print anytime soon. There are no current plans for anything like that. I think as long as there's an audience for it, we're going to keep producing it. But definitely the younger audience is orienting more toward digital.
These particular issues raise the larger questions, which you do in your own opinion piece. But a couple comments. If you go online for Frank Pine, you'll see the article that is called "As Journalism Jobs Disappear, Democracy is Increasingly at Risk." Comment on that, because why is that?
Well, This goes to the question or the comment on local news coverage, right? As we have fewer journalists, it becomes increasingly difficult to staff all of the beats that we want to staff to cover all of the topics we want to cover. And you get into a situation where you're making very difficult decisions about which city council meeting you're going to attend. And in some cases, you decide you're going to cover this one rather than that one because there's clearly something newsworthy happening over here. But you don't know what happens at a meeting that you don't go to, right? And you can't anticipate where news is going to break. Yeah. So I think that as we talk about democracy being at risk, we're talking about an absence of that fourth estate function of holding government accountable to the governed, of informing the citizenry, right? Because you can't inform people if you don't know what happened, if you weren't there to cover it.
It seemed to me, I used to divide the policy process into three parts: formulation, adoption, and implementation. The current limited resources focuses attention on the adoption or the approval. The whole build up to the formulation side and then what happens afterwards is much more difficult to cover in terms of journalists. If they're not there, they can cover the event of the approval, but they don't, the runner up to it or what happens afterwards isn't as closely followed.
Right, and the challenge for us is to focus our reporting on the aspects of the process where there's still an opportunity for the public to get involved or to make a difference.
Right. If it's only the announcement of the event, the public then is in many ways shut out. They find out about it.
Right.
Let me also read to you your final comment you made in this. Do you want to make any? I thought this was April 15th. The Perspectives was entirely devoted to this question of the fourth estate. Do you want to? How did this? What was the thinking that led behind this, I think, rather remarkable collection of stories, including your lead story?
I think we're at a moment in time where journalism is increasingly at risk, and there is also an increasing public awareness of the plight of journalism. I also felt that we need to be transparent to our readership, and in conversations with readers, it became increasingly clear to me that people didn't understand why all these changes to the newspapers, why cover this and not cover that. So I felt that we needed to publish something that conveyed to our readership and to the community at large what's happening inside of our business, so that one, people understand what's happening in their newspaper, and two, understand the risk to journalism based on the current economic models and the fact that the traditional model for journalism is so clearly in distress.
We had a New York Times columnist spoke recently at UCR, and he was talking about putting like and dislike on stories and help confirm what should be given attention and so forth. That's sort of national stuff, and I guess the question that's really compelling here is for as you say, for an informed electorate, holding government accountable, having public discourse. What the future of journalism will be in the inland region, and what we can do about it. Let me just read you the last paragraph in your story, and if you could kind of reflect on where we are, what you're thinking about, where we're going. Journalism faces enormous challenges in adapting to the new modes of media consumption. If the fourth estate as we know it is to survive, it will require ownership that is invested in its long-term success and a strategy that prizes purpose over profits.
I think that's critical, obviously, which is why it comes at the end of the editorial piece. I think now is the time for people to invest in journalism, whether that's ownership, people who are going to buy or create new journalism enterprises, whether that's existing management teams, right? It's important for us to be creative and innovative and seek solutions that are going to stabilize the business and make it more sustainable, make the fourth estate, secure a future for the fourth estate, or whether that's stakeholders and readers who I would encourage to subscribe to some kind of journalism. Obviously my preference would be local journalism,
Yeah.
but to then underwrite that and ensure a healthy democracy into the future.
It's just personal. Is the Green Bay Packer ownership, is there any, I was trying to think of, of the ownership not by a single rich owner, but by many people, and particularly in this inland region, which you are the major reporter of. How do you see the region beginning to talk to itself about trying to support journalism? I mean, I accept, I think most people do, the premises of importance of journalism and democracy, and how do we begin as a region to start talking about what we can do rather than simply seeing ourselves as consumers of the print? How do we try to actively support journalism?
Well, I think we're doing it, right, in having this conversation and conversations like this, and that was one of the purposes of writing the editorial was to kind of provoke that aspect of the public discourse, right, to start that conversation about the importance of journalism in our communities and to begin having those conversations.
If I wanted a copy of this perspective, how could I, if a person watching us tonight or today, how would I get a copy of this?
All of those stories are online. If you want a print copy, I believe we have some. So you could write to us at your local newspaper, at the Press Enterprise or the Daily Bulletin or the Sun, depending on where you live, and we'll see if we can get you a hard copy. But it's definitely accessible online. Go to our website and search and you'll find it.
It seems to me it's something that should show up at schools. It should show up in kind of community meetings to talk about. I think this is something we need to engage in. I want to thank you for this kind of leadership in this conversation. I think each person who sat in this for the Randall Lewis seminar last night valued the comments, both where we are now and the choices we're making into the future. So, Frank, I thank you for your leadership. This is not a closed discussion. This is one that needs to continue, and your participation in leading it is exceptionally important.
Well, Ron, thank you so much for having me. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak to the group and to talk to you today. Thank you very much for your leadership and participation.
Well, thanks.
Mm-hmm.